So, hello everyone. We'll start our webinar of today. Thank you to close your microphone to help with the background noise. So, thank you very much again. We are starting that now about the trends and the future. And we have organized this webinar in partnership with Project Last Mile, people from USAID, and IAPHL. So welcome, and feel free to put any question on the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session where we'll give you the floor. So Rebecca, hello.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. I'm Rebecca Turner. I'm a Senior Supply Chain Technical Advisor sitting in the Bureau for Global Health at USAID in the Office of Population Reproductive Health in the Commodity Security Logistics Division. I'm excited to be with you today to dive in on something we hope can be meaningful for use within your context to enhance supply chain performance and service delivery and health outcomes at the last mile of the supply chain. Through mobilizing a team of experts to adapt private sector methodologies, Project Last Mile, with support from USAID, from our office, they developed a workforce strengthening performance management toolkit. The toolkit aims to enhance the efficiency of human resource management at the district level for the purposes of enhanced performance results at the last mile of the supply chain. Sorry, could you please mute? Okay, so this is to enhance performance results at the last mile of the supply chain. While USAID recognizes that there are many upstream challenges, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll try again. We recognize at USAID that there are many upstream challenges that may affect supply availability at the last mile. We know that there are missed opportunities right now that do affect service outcomes and health outcomes at the decentralized, so that district level of the supply chain. For example, unavailability due to human resource management, worker motivation, or the absence of data visibility, or even the absence of data being used when decisions are made at that level. Thus, we embarked and invested to learn more in partnership with Project Last Mile as to what the best practices are for integrating supply chain performance indicators into the way that people are being managed within an organization to inform the development of tools that you'll learn and see today. We assessed last mile delivery models, data flows, and decision-making in two vast contexts to ensure that the learnings and the reach of what was developed could be utilized globally. The toolkit provides managers with 16 tools and templates for data-driven personnel and performance management with detailed guidance on how and when to use them. The toolkit can be downloaded into Word or Excel, and it's available in English and French. I know we have people joining us from French-speaking countries, so the toolkit is available in French. And so now I'd like to introduce our speakers from Project Last Mile that'll be able to share this good work with you today during our webinar. Karin Remmelzwaal is a delivery manager with Project Last Mile. She has 10 years of experience in project operations strategy and partnership across public and private sectors, and she holds a master's in public health. Heidi Lamont is a seasoned human resource leader with over 25 years of experience, primarily within the Coca-Cola system. Her roles range from HR director for Turkey, Central Asia, and she is also an HR practice lead within Coca-Cola's consultancy division, where she specialized in understanding client needs and delivering tailored people-centered solutions. She holds 3 postgraduate degrees in counseling psychology, industrial psychology, and human resource development. And Jonathan Halse. He leads supply chain redesign projects across Africa with Project Last Mile and has extensive experience at Coca-Cola, holding leadership roles in operations and consultancy, specializing specifically in route to market strategy. And his expertise also includes serving as CEO for a joint venture in China and contributing to projects with Coca-Cola's Eurasia and Africa group. So without further ado, I'm really excited you get to hear directly from our experts, and we'll start, and I'll hand it over to Jonathan to dive right in with more on the project scope and last mile delivery model fundamentals and management tools. Thanks so much. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Becky. Natty, if you can go to slide 6, that'd be great. Great. Now you're on slide 7. Back one. Great. So this is the project scope of what we set out to do. So essentially, as Becky has very kindly covered in her initial summary, the project scope was set up that we would develop a toolkit to assist performance management of last mile delivery staff within public health systems, and a toolkit that would be able to be used across all the diverse operating environments of Africa. So the toolkit was based on the best-in-class private sector or FMCG performance management practices, particularly the system, and it was focused on what we felt was staff focus, covering the last mile. So specifically, that would be delivery drivers, helpers, supervisors, and anybody related to delivery of that last mile. And the approach took essentially 4 steps, or we approached it in a phased process. So the first phase really was to look at consulting stakeholders. We actually selected 2 countries up front that we would work with specifically to understand in more detail how performance management processes had worked, particularly within supply chain in public health sectors. And those were Rwanda and Togo. Once we'd explored how performance management was applied in those 2 countries, we then moved on to an internal landscape review within the Coca-Cola system to really identify best practice, both in last mile delivery and also in performance management. So once we understood what those best practices were, we then adapted them into the toolkit. And then finally, the 4th phase was to disseminate the toolkit specifically in the 2 countries that we'd selected, Rwanda and Togo, where we ran workshops to sort of test the reception, to test understanding, to make sure it was fit for purpose for their needs. So that's essentially the project scope. It took roughly 18 months to do and finished in October last year. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Natty. So the approach that we took when we started setting out the toolkit was really to establish, first of all, what good last mile delivery looks like. Because we felt that if we were to implement a performance management process on a last mile delivery model that was not optimized, then performance would not necessarily improve. So we felt that structurally we had to give guidance on how to improve a last mile delivery model to make it more optimized for the local operating environment. And a lot of the toolkit in the first half of the toolkit is focused on methodologies that the Coca-Cola company uses to design an optimized last mile delivery model across the different operating environments within Africa. The second stage was then, once we'd given guidance on designing an optimized last mile delivery model, we then looked at creating a performance management framework that would enable the staff working within those models to perform based on the expectations being set within those models. So that was the approach that we took. So it was very much the first half is around designing and optimize the last mile delivery model, and the second half then is getting staff to perform within that model. We go on to the next slide. Natty, thank you. So the Coca-Cola company typically looks at designing a last mile delivery model in 3 steps, and that's what I'm now going to take you through. So the first one really is establishing a look of success. So what do we mean by this? Essentially, it is what does the last mile delivery model aim to achieve? So what is its objective? And you can see here, there are 3 areas we typically focus on when we look at public health systems. So the first one is making sure that the right portfolio is made available at the various health facility segments. So an example would be a hospital. A large sort of urban hospital would have a very different portfolio to maybe a rural health clinic. So essentially, we look at what portfolio needs to be made available at each of the different segments. What we also look at then is the second area, which is inventory, which is optimizing the quantity of inventory that's supplied to each facility. So clearly, if you give too much inventory, it can expire or get damaged, or maybe there's insufficient storage available at the health facility to hold it. And if you give too little, they'll run out of stock quite quickly. So in the quantity of inventory is also quite important. And then finally, which is a third area, which we didn't really touch on, particularly with this toolkit, is the area of program education, really supporting program education through placement of materials at the health facilities, and potentially providing basic training to the health clinicians to deliver the services that are optimized for those particular health. So that's the first step. So that's covered off in the toolkit. The second step, if we can go to the next slide, please. So the second step is then to look at how we set ourselves up, how the model is set up to deliver that picture or that look of success. So this is all around what we call the customer service architecture. So the Coca-Cola company uses a number of capabilities. You can see here on this chart, there's 8 capabilities listed, everything from ordering through to communication, so making sure that program materials are available, through to equipment where necessary, particularly with things like cold equipment for vaccines. So there's a list of capabilities, and we designate who is responsible or what activities need to be done at the health facility to ensure these capabilities are achieved. So who does it, and by health facility type, which health facility receives each of these capabilities, how frequently they do it. So typically in most health systems, it's quarterly. And then ideally the capacity. So how many facilities are visited or worked with on each working day. So this is the next stage, is to actually figure out what the service architecture should be. And that's also covered within the toolkit, how to develop this. So the third step, next slide. The third step then is to look at having set out what the look of success is, so what we're trying to achieve, how do we go about achieving it? We then measure the performance. So we see, are we actually achieving this look of success? So the third step really is to look at what we call a customer service satisfaction model. So this focuses on service levels and how well we're meeting the service needs of the facility. So we typically survey, as you can see on the left-hand side, a range of service attributes. So how well is order fulfillment meant? Delivery, does delivery turn up on time, as an example? The quality of staff, are they knowledgeable? Are they helpful? Are they friendly? And so on. So there's a range of attributes that we survey. And we put these into what we call a quadrant chart, which is on the right-hand side, which looks at performance and importance. And obviously those attributes that are very important to our customers, which is on the high side, on the right-hand side of this chart. And where we perform well, as you can see, we would continue to do those. However, if they're low importance and we don't perform very well, we would stop doing those attributes. So this is a measure of customer service quality, and the toolkit shares how to perform this customer service survey. So that's one area that we focus on when we look at performance indicators. So the next slide, please. Having looked at customer service, we then look at what is typically covered within within public health, which is operational metrics. And you can see here 5 areas where typically you would be tracking performance, everything from order placement through to route completion. So making sure whatever facilities you're due to cover that day with your delivery vehicle, you actually go to all of them on time and on schedule. That you're delivering the correct order, that you're helping with inventory management. So maybe you put, when you deliver, maybe the delivery driver and the helper helps put them onto the shelf on a first expiry, first out basis, as an example. And then, accurate administration documentation where relevant, if there's any kind of cash or credit, collection is done. So these are the other areas that we would be monitoring and measuring. So next slide. So that's the way that the Coca-Cola company would typically design a last mile delivery model. And this is the approach that Project Last Mile have been using across a number now of countries or territories across Africa, where we've redesigned their last mile delivery model very effectively. So what I want to do now is just share with you the tools that are available within the toolkit. You can see here there's 9 tools that are available. I'm not going to take you through all of them, but we can share a couple of examples of the tools that would be available. So if we go to the next slide. So this is an example of one of the tools that's available, and it's essentially a time motion study analysis that we do when we redesign a last mile delivery model for a public health system. So what you can see here on the left-hand side of this table is all those activities that I mentioned earlier, which we referred to need to be done when a last mile delivery staff visits health facilities. So everything from pre-visit preparation, obviously waiting for the staff within the health facility to become available. There's an element of relationship building. Maybe we do equipment checks. There's maybe a storage check. We count and record stock, and so on. These could well be the capabilities that are performed. And then for each of the different segments of hospital, health center, and clinic, you then look at a allocation of a time, and the frequency refers to how often they're done. So if it's 100%, it means every time that the facility is visited, that activity is done. If it's 50%, it means 1 every 2 visits it's done. And a variable refers to, as you can see here, count and record stock. It's 178. That typically refers to something like the number of products that are being, that are planned to be held at that particular health facility. So by using all this data, we're able to calculate the amount of time it should take for a last mile delivery team to complete a visit to a health facility, depending on whether they're a hospital, a health center, or a clinic, and depending on the activities they had to perform. And all this data is basically derived from over 38 countries from the Coca-Cola system initially within Africa. But it has been further refined based on our findings through the work that we've been doing with public health systems in various African countries, where we've actually measured the amount of time. So this typically is surprisingly accurate when it comes to predicting how much time is actually required when you make a visit to a health facility. So that's useful information. So we understand how much time is being spent in a facility. If we then look at travel time, so let's go on to the next tool, Natty. So there's another tool within the toolkit which enables you to figure out the travel time between facilities. So here you can see it's split into the demand variability. So how many health facilities you're going to be visiting for that particular route day. The travel time is calculated a combination of stem time, which is when you go from your storage location to the first health facility, from the last health facility back to the storage facility. Then travel time between the health facilities is the other component for travel time. And then we can work out the amount of time available based on, we know from the previous tool, how much time it takes to do a visit. We know how much time it takes to travel both to the area and within the area between the health facilities. You can then start to understand what the capacity is to how many health facilities you can actually service within a day for your particular last mile delivery model that you have in place. So these are two examples of the tools in the toolkit that enables you or will help you to establish what the most optimum number of visits would be in a day within your territory. Why is that useful? If you can understand that, then you can manage the performance of the LMD staff that are doing delivery. Because if they can only do 6 facilities in a day, but you target them to do 10, they're never going to perform to that number. They're never going to get to 10. However, if they can do 6, but you're only targeting them to do 3, then they're only going to be working half a day, as an example. So it's very, very useful information to have. But these are just 2 of the 9 tools. There's many other tools in there that will assist you in designing the optimum last mile delivery model. So I think I stop there, and I think I'll hand over to Heidi now.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Jonathan. Natty, if we can move on to, I don't know the number slide, but
I can let me move and you can stop me.
No, the other way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There we go. That one. We can start there. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. So we've listened now, thanks, Jonathan, to what, at a very high level, to what a good last mile delivery model looks like. And that informs the individual accountability piece. So the next section will focus on the performance management process. And that in itself speaks to individual accountability and contribution to this, what good looks like, that Jonathan just explained to us. Now, if we say performance management, people often say to me, but managing performance is an integral part of any leader's role. Absolutely, yes. So we're not disclaiming that. This process just provides a frame or a process or a structure to bring clarity and to drive the individual accountability throughout the of what good looks like. So I'm talking specifically about the structured process of performance management. Next slide. One more. Thank you. One more. There we go. So there we go. Thank you. So when we talk about a structured performance management process, it can be, it can be divided in however many phases, but the best practice out there, you generally find 4 phases of a management process. The one is the planning. The second one is where you monitor and review the performance, and that includes development, which is a phase in itself, and we'll go through these. And then finally, the outcomes of it, the reward, the recognition, the consequences of the performance management process. I think on this slide, just important to call out, you will find this is a rolling 12-month process. So it happens over a 12-month process, and there are different touch points throughout the months. And then typically in private sector and best practice in private sector, it aligns to the financial year. So when it starts and when it ends may differ, but it's 12 months and it usually aligns to the financial year. Thanks. Next slide. Right. So the first phase, as I've said on the previous slide, is planning. And the outcome of this phase would be your performance and development plan. Right. So it's just the first phase. It's the plan. It's the actual document that was constructed. And I'll just talk through the steps involved. It starts really with how does if I'm the individual, if I'm in the team and I'm the individual, how does what I align with what my team needs to deliver, and how does what the team need to deliver align to the organizational goal? So it starts with understanding or having a line of sight from the bigger goals of the organization right through the teams or departments, teams, and then eventually into the individual space. And then only when that's established do you start pulling out, okay, what are the goals that I will be held accountable for? And for each goal, you will also then set how it will be, the standards, and how it will be measured. So your typical performance key indicators, your KPIs as we refer to it, will be used to measure the performance. And remember, as I said earlier, you will also have development goals as part of this document. Typically, we use the SMART methodology when we set the goals, again, just to make sure that there's clarity. And SMART, the acronym, I think many of us have used it. So it's a specific, it's measurable, it's attainable, usually with a bit of stretch. It's relatable, and it is time-bound. So typically, it's a nice acronym to remember, and we work through that in the toolkit. I think also important to call out that these plans are not static, it is dynamic, but any change in the plan would have to be signed off it can't be a willy-nilly change. It is meant to drive clarity and focus, so we try and stick to it. I think, next slide, I think that's fine. I think it's important to connect by saying that once you have the plan, I always say, many people think, well, that's performance management done because you have your plan, but definitely not. This is just where it starts. So the plan is not to go in the drawer. The plan is to be used to drive the next 12 months. This is just literally the very first milestone in your plan. So now we get to the phase where people are performing their jobs, and we have to really keep that performance on track. So it's that monitoring and reviewing. And it's easy to think of it in two different steps or contributors. The first is ongoing conversation. So these are the conversations where, and usually this is weekly, at the very least weekly, but this is where you sort of say, as a supervisor or as a leader, you have the conversation where it goes, what are you working on? What are you struggling with? Can I assist you? How can I make it? How can I help you achieve your goals? From where I'm these are the things I think you could perhaps do differently, or I can connect you with this one. And this is also for the individual contributor to say, I need help here. This is a barrier. Just, give me some coaching here. So it's that staying in touch, that connectivity between the supervisor and the individual. And it helps with like early course correction. These conversations are critical because you don't want to do, which is the second part. Next slide, please. You don't want to go into the more formal reviews, typically 2 a year, and sudden surprises appear. So if you've done enough and good connections throughout the year, there would have been course corrections, and and when you get to the more formal review, you would limit the number of surprises. And if I say formal review, this is where ratings take place, right? So typically you would have a 5-point, and in many instances, there's a 0 added on, and that's just to indicate the individual is too new in the role. So your scale typically works from a 1 to 5. I think we're quite familiar with that, but just to call it out, the middle of the scale, the 3, would be fully meets requirements. And then a 5, top end of the scale, would be not only fully meets, but also frequently exceeds. The other side speaks for itself, it's underperformance. Those are the surprises you want to avoid. So typical steps involved in the review meeting. There would be a step where there's preparation, and note preparation by both the supervisor and the employee. So both parties would independently, sort of gather the evidence, keep the examples, get feedback, do some prelim scoring to go into the actual meeting, which is the discussion. Step 2, where you share, both sides share their input and you come to an agreement. Then step 3, which is, this is not always going to happen, depending on the maturity of the performance management in an organization. But you have 10 teams, for instance, last mile delivery teams. This would typically be where the leaders come together and they present their teams and scores with some evidence. And we refer to this really as the calibration, because as much as you have a scale with definitions and examples, a 5-point scale with definitions and examples, individuals still interpret, for instance, a 3 differently, or they interpret a 2 differently. So the calibration meeting is to sort of level set and just to check any outliers, and that we have all interpreted the ratings as close as possible to the same way. That's calibration. And then if calibration had happened, then of course you have to close the loop by providing the individual the final feedback on their ratings and their scores. Next slide, please. Right, this is the phase 3, which is development. So this is the performance and development plan, right? That's the language we should use. And this refers to development as it relates to delivering your job or the goals, the performance goals that you have set. This is the opportunity for the supervisor and the individual to co-create a plan, an individual performance plan. And it starts with understanding what is required to deliver the job or the goals as set out, the performance goals. Once you have clarity on that, then you look at the individual and what their strengths and development areas are, or where they're struggling, or what they need to just lift their game. That's the conversation. And then collectively you agree the plan, the development plan, that is. So in this case, what we in the toolkit, what we elaborate on is, from a development point of view, is the 70-20-10 approach to development. So 70%, very superficially, 70% of the development required you do through experiential learning, right? 20% through sort of exposure or social learning, and only 10% through structured courses and programs. So the more formal, traditional learning. So you would notice from this approach to development that coaching, for instance, could be relevant in approximately 90 to 100% of the times. So in the toolkit, next slide, please. So with that in mind, in the toolkit, we spend quite a bit of time just talking through the role of a supervisor as a coach. And we actually look at some sort of tools to help supervisors in being good coaches. And one of the well-known ones, and I'm sure, again, many of us would have worked with this, one of the easy, well-known ones, methodologies we promote is the GROW model, which really just speaks to, you start by determining development goal, what the reality is, the issues around it, what options exist, and then how to address it, how to move forward. So we spend a bit of time on the GROW model. Next slide, please. And then finally, phase 4, which speaks to probably the outcome, right? The end result of it. So and this is really about the two principles that are critical. The one is that in performance management, it becomes more transparent that some individuals contribute more than others, right? It's quite obvious. And we also understand the principle that consequences, well, both negative and positive, but consequences drive behavior, right? So given that, the consequences of performance management can drive a certain culture of performance in the organization. But it's important to understand that consequences are not necessarily monetary only. It really could be monetary, but also any and everything that employees perceive to be of value, right? So, and you would see there, whether it is development and career opportunities, whether it's work-life balance, various employee engagement opportunities. So it speaks to all of that. It's not necessarily only monetary. We have also seen, and we are very aware that if you want to, for instance, focus on monetary as a consequence of a performance management process, for instance, pay for performance is a well-known concept. I think it's important to understand that then the performance management needs to be well established in the organization and followed with good discipline. And if it's at that level of maturity, you can really move into a monetary consequence. It makes more sense to move into monetary consequences of performance management. But outside of that, there are a lot of other opportunities in terms of consequences. And those are the 4 steps that we obviously spend more time on in the toolkit and unpacking it in more depth. But as Jonathan did, I wanted to highlight, next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight, and I won't be going into any of these. I think there's 7. Yeah, 7. We have also provided 7 tools and templates just to support the phases that I've just explained and to provide more structure to make it easier to implement. And that really concludes my section. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll give back the floor to Rebecca.
Great. Natty, perhaps I'll take it from here as we do the Q&A from our side. Thank you. And thank you to Jonathan and Heidi. It was very clear and interesting for me, at least. We'd now love to hand over to the floor to the participants of this webinar to ask for any questions for Jonathan and Heidi. You can pop them in the chat, or we'll pause for a moment and let you unmute yourselves. Before we do that, I'd like to start with one question that's come through in the chat already from Michael. Thank you, Michael. And Michael, if I could ask you to unmute and perhaps rephrase or just read out your question, and then Jonathan is ready to give the A to your Q. Great, Michael. And perhaps you can't talk at the moment, so I will just read out the question, Jonathan, and then if you could address it. My understanding is that there are assumptions behind an ideal LMD tool, which then informs performance definition. How would you describe the deviation or alignment of the Rwanda and Togo situation from the ideal LMD assumptions embedded in the tool? Are there measures in place to replicability of outputs from the different stakeholders engaged in one country, as a survey is a key step in the LMD tool development? Jonathan, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so let's take the first one, which is there any deviation or alignment of the Rwanda or Togo situation from the ideal LMD assumptions in the tool? I guess the answer to this is that the tool is really designed to enable each country to develop the optimal LMD model for their particular operating environment. So there is no ideal one-size-fits-all. So what works in one country may not necessarily work in another. So, understanding whether there's a deviation in Rwanda or Togo against any kind of ideal model, unfortunately it's not as simple as that. It doesn't work that way. Both Rwanda and Togo have elements of their last mile delivery model that works really well, and some areas where they can improve. But fundamentally, what the tool does is it gives you a way to design and develop the ideal optimal last mile delivery model for your particular operating environment in your country. So that's what it's set up to do. For the second part of the question, are there measures in place to ensure or assure replicability of outputs from different stakeholders engaged in one country? The tool doesn't really address stakeholder engagement and involvement in the last mile delivery model processes. That is assumed. The tools that we provide for you are there to be used by the system in place that's supporting the public health system in the country. So if there are donors or other stakeholders involved in last mile delivery, they should have an input into some of the data that goes into some of the tools, which then generates the outputs that you need to develop your model that works for you. So it's not covered specifically in the toolkit, but one of our assumptions was it would be expected that would happen. So hopefully that answers that question. Back to you, Karin.
You're on mute, Karin.
Right, that was bound to happen to somebody. We have 2 more questions in the chat. Leila, I'll take yours first, that we haven't piloted this yet or rolled this out yet in any country. We hope to do so soon in the next phase. And then Michael has a question for Heidi. Heidi, so I'll just read this out and then hand it over to you. Michael's unable to talk at the moment. And he asks, who's the target audience to use this 4-phase approach to LMIC at the last mile? So who is the user of this toolkit, I think he means. And then how do we factor in the capability to follow through and sustain the performance management implementation? So that's an easy one for you, Heidi. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael, for the question. So again, just to repeat that we haven't actually implemented this. We are moving forward with phase 2, and we're busy finalizing that, where implementation will come into play. What we have done is share the workshop content in Togo and Rwanda up to date, but actual implementation will move on to phase 2. In terms of the audience, again, it would be at the last mile. So the delivery drivers, supervisors would be the target, but we are finalizing that in phase 2. I think follow through, will their capability to follow through and sustain performance management be considered? That's probably one of the critical behavioral change management elements for anybody implementing performance management. It's a whole new way of making sure people are held accountable. So in full alignment with you, as part of the change management, we would have to look at that. And whether it's in this situation or even in private sector, that becomes the challenging part. But we're well aware of it, and we will be working with the teams to help them to get this right. Let me just see. Which countries have this been done? As I've said, no, it's not been implemented. We have, however, done the initial work and shared the tools with Rwanda and Togo so far. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And we're just going to do a quick poll now, if that's all right with everybody. These questions will briefly flash up on your screen for our own knowledge. And then after the poll, we'll pause again to give you time for extra questions as we see them come in.
Okay, so you should see the poll on your screen, and yeah.
All right, thank you all so much. So yes, now just opening the floor for any other questions that were not put in the chat. I'll just pause for 20 seconds. Please unmute yourselves and ask us live any questions you have. Hi, Rodrigo. Sorry, we're unable to hear you clearly. It sounds a bit echoey. You could perhaps try again if you were trying to ask a question. All right, well, thank you all so much. We are very readily available. Any other questions that come to mind over the next few days, please, you have Natty's address as well as ours. It's available in the toolkit, and Timmy put the toolkit in the chat earlier today. So please have a look at it. It's there in English and French, and we really would welcome your comments on it.
So let me share the result of the...
Oh, interesting. Great, thank you so much. It's quite a spread of results, which is great interest across it. Thank you. This will be very useful for us as we think about how to share it further. Ourselves and USAID are very interested in further dissemination. The toolkit is free to use. So yeah, please let us know if you're of interest or if we can give an introduction to it in another sphere. Great, I'm just double checking in the comments. Great, no new questions. So thank you, Natty. That was all from us on the PLM side and the USAID side.
Thank you very much. So
yeah.
Yes, please, Timmy, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and very much so much gratitude to the PLM team and the USAID team for sharing with us. I just shared on the chat to reconfirm how we can access the toolkits. I know that it's available in French and English. I just want to know how accessible it is. I'm sure we can find a way of addressing that much later if we cannot on this call. But I want to thank everyone who participated on this call. Yeah, LMD is a very important topic to all of us, because that is where whatever we do upstream finally gets its value by getting product into the hands of the patient that need it. So it's a continuous conversation. If you have any question, engage us on the listserv, and you can also reach out to us to reach the team at PLM for the toolkit. So this is over from here to Natty and Karin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timmy. And I have just put the link for the toolkit in the chat. And we'll send through around, just a little summary of this webinar and have it there again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.